Chapter 1. Before Mississippi was Mississippi. Long before a single cannon echoed across Vicksburg's hills, or the word Mississippi was ever spoken by English lips, a vast and intricate world thrived in the green river valleys and humid pine forests of the deep South. The land we now call Mississippi was not a blank canvas waiting for Europeans to arrive. It was a world alive with rhythm, spirit, and civilization. It was a place where people built mountains of earth to touch the sky, where rivers served as highways, and where entire societies flourished under the dense canopy of time. To understand the story of Mississippi, we must go back, thousands of years back, into the long shadows of prehistory, to an age when the landscape echoed not with the cries of war or the speeches of governors, but with the songs and rituals of peoples whose names are lost, but whose achievements still rise from the soil. The first known civilization to shape this land was not just a tribe or a wandering group of hunters. They were builders, visionaries, and their legacy was carved not in stone or parchment, but in earth. At a site known today as Poverty Point, near the northeastern edge of present-day Louisiana, but tied closely to the region that would become Mississippi, a people emerged who defied the expectations of their time. Around 1500 BCE, while much of Europe still lingered in the early stages of the Bronze Age, this American civilization built one of the most astonishing prehistoric engineering feats in North America. Massive, semicircular ridges, man-made and precisely arranged, curved like ancient waves through the land. At the heart of Poverty Point stood mounds rising above the terrain, the largest of which, Mound A, stretched 10 stories tall. But it was not just the size that mattered. It was what the mounds meant. These were not burial mounds, not mere piles of dirt. They were platforms, ceremonial centers, possibly even living quarters. They were aligned with celestial movements. They were the beating heart of a trade network that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, bringing obsidian from the Rockies, copper from the Great Lakes, soapstone from the Appalachians. These people, often wrongly imagined as simple hunters, had become cultural architects. They moved earth with baskets and bare hands. They measured, they planned, and they built something to last, something sacred. But time is relentless, and the Poverty Point culture eventually faded, replaced by waves of other societies who each added their voice to the deepening history of this land. The most influential of these were the peoples of the Mississippian culture, whose rise around 800 CE would shape the cultural DNA of the entire Southeast. Like the Poverty Point builders before them, the Mississippians were mound builders. But their mounds grew larger, their societies more complex, their influence greater. Where rivers met and fertile soil promised abundance, they built cities. The great centers, Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, Moundville in Alabama, and smaller sites in Mississippi itself, hummed with activity. Massive plazas served as ceremonial stages. Elevated platforms supported temples and the homes of chiefs. The Mississippi River was their lifeline, their avenue of commerce and communication. Crops of corn, squash, and beans, known as the Three Sisters, fed growing populations, while finely crafted pottery and tools bore witness to their artistry. In the lands that would become Mississippi, Mississippian towns dotted the bluffs and bottomlands. One of the most prominent sites, now called Winterville, rose near the modern city of Greenville. It stood proudly with its own pyramidal mounds and ceremonial center, an echo of the same patterns seen across the southeastern woodlands. Here, societies were stratified, governed by powerful leaders often regarded as divine. Religion and politics were inseparable. The sun was central, its rising and setting marking seasons, rituals, and the lives of those beneath its gaze. This was not a single empire, but a cultural system, a web of chiefdoms and settlements linked by belief, trade, and shared traditions. Warfare was frequent, but so was alliance. These were civilizations built on rhythm, of the river, of the harvest, of celestial events, and of spiritual balance. And then came a shift. Slowly, perhaps imperceptibly at first. The great mounds grew quiet. The reasons are still debated. Climate change, resource depletion, political collapse, disease. But by the time Europeans set foot on the continent in the 1500s, the great Mississippian centers had declined. In their place stood new nations, descendants, heirs, and survivors of that older world. Their names would become familiar to colonial scribes: Choctaw, Chickasaw, Natchez. The Choctaw were one of the largest and most influential nations in the southeastern United States, numbering in the tens of thousands. They lived in permanent villages, with houses built of wattle and daub, surrounded by cornfields, forests, and streams. Their political system was decentralized, divided into 3 main regions, each with its own leadership, but their identity was strong, known as skilled farmers, traders, and diplomats. The Choctaw adapted the traditions of their mound-building ancestors into a new age. Their ball games, especially the rough and sacred sport known as stickball, echoed both competition and ritual. Their stories, passed from elder to child by the fireside, kept alive the memory of creation, migration, and survival. North of the Choctaw, the Chickasaw thrived in smaller, more mobile communities. Fiercely independent and often warlike, the Chickasaw controlled vital trade routes and hunting grounds stretching into Tennessee and Alabama. Unlike their Choctaw cousins, they embraced a more hierarchical and martial culture. Their warriors were renowned, their diplomacy sharp, and their adaptability profound. They would later prove to be one of the most resilient tribes in dealing with European powers, often leveraging their strength to gain strategic advantage. But perhaps no group captured the imagination of early French explorers more than the Natchez. Living along the lower Mississippi River near what is now Natchez, Mississippi, this culture retained more visible traces of the Mississippian ceremonial system than any other. The Natchez had a ruling class known as the Sons, including a powerful monarch, the Great Sun, who lived atop a great mound and ruled with semi-divine authority. Their society was rigidly stratified. Nobles, commoners, and honored warriors each had their place. Rituals of death and renewal governed life. When a great son died, his wives and servants were often killed and buried with him, a haunting echo of earlier mound-building elites. The Natchez world was one of pomp and pageantry, beauty and brutality. Their homes were adorned with woven mats and intricate wood carvings. Their temples burned eternal fires. Their sacred mounds stood as silent witnesses to their worldview, that life, death, and divinity were all part of the same circle. While each of these nations was distinct, linguistically, politically, and culturally, they shared deep connections. They believed in balance, in the sacredness of nature, in the presence of spirits in every river and tree. Trade flowed between them like the rivers that shaped their territories. Shells from the Gulf Coast, flint from the north, and copper from the mountains passed through many hands. Ideas moved just as freely. Religions, stories, political customs. And while war was common, so too was peace. Councils were held, gifts exchanged, and marriages arranged across tribal lines. These were not isolated tribes hiding in the woods, but complex societies interacting across a vast landscape. They lived with the land, not against it, building their calendars from the sky, their homes from the forest, their myths from the world around them. By the time the first Spanish conquistadors trampled through the southeast in the 1500s, this world was vibrant, fragile, and largely unknown to outsiders. The arrival of Hernando de Soto in 1540 would bring not only steel and fire, but disease, deadly waves of illness that would ripple through native populations even ahead of European settlements. The civilizations that had thrived here for millennia were about to be tested by forces they could never have imagined. But that is the story of another chapter. For now, let us remember Mississippi as it once was, a land of temples made from earth, of sacred fire and eternal rivers, of people who built their lives in harmony with the land long before they had to defend it. It was a world where names were spoken in Chickasaw and Choctaw, not English or French, where the land was alive with stories, and where Mississippi's true history began, not with maps and flags, but with mounds, myths, and the voices of a people who called it home before the world gave it a name. Chapter 2: Conquistadors and Colonies. By the early 1500s, whispers of golden cities and rich new lands filled the courts of Europe with feverish ambition. The Americas, still only faintly outlined on maps, offered promises as wild as they were dangerous. The Spanish, fresh from their bloody triumph over the Aztecs, were hungry for more. They had tasted the wealth of the New World in Mexico and Peru, and now they turned their gaze toward the vast interior of the continent. Somewhere, they believed, there had to be another empire waiting to be conquered, another hoard of gold waiting to be seized. And so, in the spring of 1539, a Spanish nobleman named Hernando de Soto landed on the western coast of Florida with over 600 soldiers, 200 horses, a herd of pigs, and dreams of conquest burning in his heart. De Soto had been second in command under Francisco Pizarro in the conquest of the Inca Empire. He was already rich, but it wasn't enough. He wanted glory, a governorship, immortality. And so he set out on one of the most ambitious and brutal expeditions in the history of the Americas. An expedition that would carve a bloody trail through the southeast and bring him face to face with the lands of future Mississippi. For nearly 3 years, De Soto and his army hacked their way through thick forests, crossed rivers, burned villages, enslaved natives, and demanded food, gold, and obedience. They marched through present-day Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and eventually descended into the lands of the Chickasaw and Choctaw. The Spaniards were unlike anything the native peoples had ever seen. Armored men on horseback, carrying weapons of thunder, led by a man who spoke of kings across the ocean and claimed divine right over all he saw. But there was no gold here, no pyramids, no palaces, just forests, rivers, and proud people who refused to kneel. When De Soto arrived in what is now Mississippi in 1541, he found no empire to conquer, only fierce resistance. The Chickasaw, wary and battle-tested, refused to submit. They saw through the lies, the empty promises, the false diplomacy. They played the Spaniards for time, then struck. One night, as the Spaniards slept near a Chickasaw village, hundreds of warriors launched a coordinated attack, setting fire to the Spanish camp and killing dozens. The invaders barely escaped with their lives. Much of their equipment, weapons, and supplies were lost. The expedition never recovered. De Soto, weakened by fever and desperation, pressed on westward in search of salvation. Instead, He found the Great River. In May of 1541, Hernando de Soto stood on the banks of what the natives called the Mississippi, the Great River. It was a vast, brown serpent that moved with the slow, unstoppable power of time itself. To the Spanish, it was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. They called it the Rio Grande del Espiritu Santo. For de Soto, it must have felt like the end of the world. There would be no cities of gold, no empire, no legacy. Less than a year later, de Soto died, somewhere in present-day Louisiana or Mississippi. And his men, terrified that the natives would see his death as a sign of weakness, buried his body in the river's depths. Only a fraction of the original expedition made it back to Spanish territory. But the damage was done. The diseases carried by de Soto's men, smallpox, measles, influenza, would ripple through the southeast long after the last conquistador vanished. Entire native villages would be wiped out within a generation. Some were gone before they ever met a white man. De Soto had failed to find gold, but he had unwittingly unleashed a force that would forever alter the course of Mississippi's history. For over a century afterward, the interior of the Southeast remained largely untouched by European settlement. The Spanish focused on Mexico and the Caribbean. The English established colonies along the Atlantic coast. But it was the French who would next turn their eyes toward the Mississippi River and the lush lands that bordered it. To them, the river was not a dead end, but a highway, a path into the heart of the continent, and they were determined to claim it before anyone else could. In 1682, a French explorer named René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, stood at the mouth of the Mississippi River and declared it for France. He named the entire watershed, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, La Louisiane, in honor of King Louis XIV. It was an audacious claim, but one made with purpose. Control of the Mississippi meant control of trade, territory, and influence. The French vision was not one of brute conquest, but of commerce, diplomacy, and settlement. They would build alliances with native tribes, trade fur and guns, and establish forts along the river's path. By the early 1700s, French explorers and missionaries had begun moving up and down the Mississippi, planting the seeds of empire. Among the most important outposts was Fort Rosalie, founded in 1716 on a high bluff overlooking the river near a native Natchez village. This would become the foundation for the modern city of Natchez, the oldest permanent European settlement on the lower Mississippi. Fort Rosalie was built not just for defense, but for domination. The French intended to use it to secure control of the region, protect their traders, and assert authority over the local tribes. But the relationship with the Natchez was uneasy from the start. At first, there was trade: guns, beads, metal tools, and liquor for deerskins, corn, and tobacco. But French demands soon grew more aggressive. They sought land for plantations, labor for tobacco fields, and obedience from the native population. Tensions rose as the Natchez saw their sacred land seized and their customs disrespected. The Natchez were no strangers to diplomacy or war. Their society had survived for centuries, rooted in tradition, hierarchy, and ritual. But now they were faced with a foreign power that refused to treat them as equals. In 1729, the fragile peace finally shattered. In a coordinated assault, Natchez warriors attacked Fort Rosalie, killing most of the French settlers and soldiers. It was a dramatic act of resistance, a final stand against colonial encroachment. But it would not end well for the Natchez. The French retaliated with fury, aided by Choctaw allies eager to weaken a rival. Over the next 2 years, the Natchez were hunted, scattered, and destroyed. Survivors were enslaved or absorbed into other tribes. The nation that had once built mounds, temples, and a proud society was effectively wiped from the map. Fort Rosalie was rebuilt, and French control over the lower Mississippi tightened. The pattern was clear. The Europeans brought trade, but they also brought arrogance. They brought metal tools and muskets, but also disease, alcohol, and war. Native tribes were forced to navigate an ever-changing web of alliances and betrayals. Some, like the Choctaw, chose cooperation, seeing in the French a chance to gain weapons and advantage over old enemies. Others, like the Chickasaw, resisted fiercely, becoming a thorn in the side of both French and British ambitions. Throughout the 1700s, Mississippi was a land in flux. It was not yet a state, not yet a country, but a battleground of empires. French traders paddled their canoes up creeks and bayous. Jesuit priests preached salvation in native tongues. British agents whispered promises of trade and protection. Native chiefs weighed every offer, every threat, trying to preserve their people in a world spinning out of their control. Colonization was never a smooth or simple process. Settlements rose and fell. Forts were built, attacked, and rebuilt again. The land itself became a currency, bought, sold, stolen, and claimed by one power after another. The French controlled it until 1763, when they lost the 7 Years' War and ceded much of their North American territory to the British. Mississippi passed into British hands, only to be contested again during the American Revolution and later claimed by Spain. Through it all, the land endured. The river flowed, and the people, both native and newly arrived, continued to shape its destiny. By the late 1700s, Mississippi was no longer a mystery on a map. It was a place of farms, villages, and ambition. The Chickasaw still held the northern hills. The Choctaw watched over the central forests. French settlers farmed near Natchez. British traders operated out of Mobile. And American pioneers, hungry for land and freedom, were beginning to trickle in from the east. The foundations of a new society were being laid, one that would soon demand its own borders, laws, and identity. But the echoes of the conquistadors and colonists would never fully fade. The scars they left on the land, on the native peoples, and on the story of Mississippi would shape everything that came after. From Fort Rosalie to the Chickasaw Bluffs, from DeSoto's dying breath to the fall of the Natchez, the early history of this place is not just one of discovery. It is one of conflict, resistance, and the slow, painful birth of a new world. And that world was only beginning to rise. Chapter 3. From Territory to Statehood. By the end of the 18th century, the land that would one day be called Mississippi had already lived many lives. It had seen empires rise and vanish, rivers explored and named, and the ancient people who once built mounds and temples scattered or destroyed. But as the smoke of muskets faded and the last echoes of French and native resistance were swallowed by the forests, a new contest began, a quieter but equally relentless struggle. Not just over territory, but over identity. This was not a war fought with swords or arrows, but with treaties, land grants, and slow-moving migration. It was the beginning of Mississippi's transformation. From a colonial battleground into a state of the American Union. The land had many names before it became Mississippi. To the French, it was part of La Louisiane, a sweeping, undefined wilderness claimed in the name of King Louis XIV. To the Spanish, it was part of Florida, then West Florida, than simply disputed ground. The British, during their brief rule, called it the Natchez District and governed it from afar. But to the American settlers beginning to trickle down the Natchez Trace, the land was something else entirely: opportunity. The story of Mississippi's path to statehood is a tale of shifting borders, uncertain loyalties, and the slow, patient work of empire building through bureaucracy and migration. After the French defeat in the 7 Years' War in 1763, all of France's lands east of the Mississippi River, including present-day Mississippi, were handed over to Britain. Suddenly, British flags flew where French ones once waved. French settlers were now British subjects, and native tribes found themselves caught between old alliances and new expectations. The British saw the fertile lands of the Mississippi Valley as a prize. They carved out 2 new colonies, East Florida and West Florida. West Florida included a strip of land along the Gulf Coast, reaching up to the 31st parallel. But here, geography and ambition clashed. British settlers in the region pushed northward, and soon the British authorities unilaterally extended the northern boundary of West Florida to 32 degrees 28 minutes, an act that would cause confusion and conflict for decades. For most locals, it was business as usual. Planters farmed tobacco and indigo. Native tribes continued their trade networks, and the French, though now technically British subjects, often ignored the change in flag and kept to their own customs. But just as people began to settle into this new order, another revolution shattered the calm. In 1776, 13 colonies to the east declared their independence. The American Revolution was far away at first, felt more as a rumor than a war in the swamps and hills of West Florida. But as the conflict dragged on, its consequences rippled outward. Spain, sensing an opportunity, entered the war in 1779. Not as an ally of the Americans, but as an enemy of Britain. Spanish forces, under the command of Bernardo de Galvez, captured key British forts along the Gulf Coast, including Baton Rouge and Natchez. When the dust settled and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the map of the continent was once again redrawn. Spain retained control of West Florida. But the United States, young and ambitious, claimed the same land as part of its newly expanded borders. The problem: the U.S. insisted that West Florida extended only to the 31st parallel, as it had under original British control. Spain, now in possession of the territory, argued it extended all the way to 32 degrees 28 minutes. In between these two lines lay a fertile strip of land, what would later become part of southern Mississippi, now claimed by both powers. This so-called West Florida controversy dragged on for more than a decade, creating confusion for settlers and cartographers alike. American migrants continued to pour into the disputed region, particularly along the Natchez Bluffs, where the rich soil promised prosperity. But they lived under a shadow of legal uncertainty. Would they owe loyalty to the Spanish crown or to the American Republic? The situation came to a head in the 1790s. Spain, eager to hold on to its possessions, tried to regulate American settlement, limit trade, and reinforce its authority. But the settlers had other plans. They demanded the right to navigate the Mississippi River freely, something Spain had restricted. They wanted law, stability, and American protection. It was becoming clear that Spain's grasp on the region was slipping. Then, in 1795, diplomacy did what muskets could not. The United States and Spain signed the Treaty of San Lorenzo also known as Pinckney's Treaty, named after American negotiator Thomas Pinckney. It was a turning point in Mississippi's story. Under the treaty's terms, Spain recognized the 31st parallel as the boundary between its territory and the United States, opening the door for formal American control over the Natchez District and other disputed lands. More importantly, the treaty guaranteed American access to the Mississippi River and the right to use the port of New Orleans, crucial lifelines for commerce and settlement. It would take 2 more years before Spanish troops fully withdrew from Natchez. But by 1798, the American flag flew officially over the region, and Congress acted quickly to solidify its claim. That same year, the U.S. established the Mississippi Territory, a sprawling administrative region that included most of present-day Mississippi and Alabama. The early years of the Mississippi Territory were marked by rapid change. The federal government appointed a territorial governor, and Natchez became the seat of administration. Laws were introduced, courts established. But the real force transforming the region was not government. It was people. American settlers came in droves, drawn by the promise of land and the dream of owning their future. Some arrived via the Natchez Trace, a rugged overland route stretching from Nashville down to Natchez. Others floated down the Mississippi on flatboats, carrying goods, tools, and entire families. They brought with them the American spirit of expansion, but also its contradictions. Many of these settlers were poor whites from the upland South, eager to farm and raise livestock. But alongside them came wealthy planters from Virginia and the Carolinas, bringing enslaved Africans to work the fertile black soil. As cotton cultivation expanded, so too did slavery. The Mississippi Territory quickly mirrored the South's emerging plantation economy. By the early 1800s, cotton was king and slavery its cruel foundation. The native peoples who had once dominated the region now found themselves increasingly pushed aside. Treaties, often coerced or signed under pressure, ceded more and more land to the U.S. government. The Choctaw and Chickasaw, though still present in large numbers, were slowly being edged out. Their world was shrinking. Meanwhile, the question of statehood loomed. As the population grew, so did political demands. Settlers wanted more than territorial status. They wanted representation, infrastructure, protection, and sovereignty. In 1812, part of the original Mississippi Territory was carved off to create the new state of Louisiana. The remaining territory, essentially what would become Mississippi and Alabama, continued to grow. By 1817, the pressure had reached a tipping point. Congress passed legislation to divide the Mississippi Territory in 2, paving the way for statehood. On December 10, 1817, Mississippi was officially admitted to the Union as the 20th state. Its capital was first located in Natchez, but soon moved to the newly established town of Jackson, chosen for its central location and symbolic ties to Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. With statehood came a formal constitution, drawn up by a convention of delegates. It enshrined basic laws and rights, but also codified slavery and the disenfranchisement of black people, setting the tone for a state that would become a central battleground in the nation's most enduring struggles over race and power. Mississippi's early borders were still somewhat fluid, shaped by geography, treaty, and political need. To the north, it stretched to the Tennessee line. To the west, the Mississippi River formed a natural boundary. To the east, the Tombigbee River region was ceded to the newly created Alabama Territory. And to the south, the Gulf of Mexico opened the state to trade. and to the conflicts that would soon define the Deep South. But for now, in 1817, Mississippi was no longer a contested wilderness, no longer a province of European empires, no longer an unnamed frontier. It was a state, a young, ambitious, often unruly member of the American experiment. Its fields were filled with cotton, and its politics with fire. Its history had been forged in conquest, compromise, and migration. And its future, though full of promise, would be shaped by the same tensions that had defined its past. Land, labor, identity, and who would have the right to claim them? The story of Mississippi was just beginning. But its roots, buried deep in soil once walked by conquistadors, cleared by settlers, and stolen from tribes, would never be far from the surface. Chapter 4. King Cotton and Slavery. When Mississippi entered the Union in 1817, it was still a young frontier state, raw and unsettled in many parts. But beneath the forests and swamps lay soil of astonishing richness, a deep black loam that seemed almost designed by nature for one crop: cotton. And as the 19th century unfolded, that crop would transform Mississippi from a rugged borderland into the beating heart of the Deep South's plantation empire. It would bring unimaginable wealth to a few, unimaginable suffering to many, and it would define Mississippi's identity for generations. This is the story of King Cotton and the slavery that made it possible. The rise of cotton in Mississippi cannot be understood without considering a single invention that changed the world. In 1793, a young man named Eli Whitney, working in Georgia, developed a machine that seemed almost magical in its simplicity. The cotton gin, short for engine, could quickly separate cotton fibers from their sticky seeds, a process that had previously taken countless hours of hand labor. With this invention, what had once been an arduous, limiting task suddenly became efficient. Cotton could now be produced on a massive scale, and it seemed as if the only limit was the number of acres one could plant and the number of enslaved hands one could force into labor. The timing could not have been more consequential. The new United States was hungry for economic engines, and the textile mills of Britain and New England were hungry for raw cotton. The global market practically begged for supply, and Mississippi, with its fertile delta soil, mild climate, and abundant rivers for transport, was poised to answer. It was as if the land itself conspired to make cotton king. And so, in the decades after statehood, Mississippi was transformed. Forests were cleared, swamps drained, rivers harnessed, and fields stretched endlessly in white rows that shimmered under the southern sun. Cotton became not just a crop, but a way of life, a measure of wealth and a symbol of power. It was not merely planted, it ruled. But cotton did not grow itself. Its empire was built on the backs of enslaved men, women, and children. By the mid-19th century, slavery had become not just an institution in Mississippi. It was the institution, the economic engine upon which everything else depended. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were bought and sold in markets from Natchez to New Orleans. Families were torn apart, children ripped from parents, husbands from wives, all in service to a system that reduced human beings to property. Plantations stretched across the Delta and the Natchez district, each one a kingdom unto itself. Some were modest, with a handful of enslaved workers and a few acres of cotton. Others were vast, sprawling enterprises, with hundreds of enslaved laborers bending beneath the sun, picking and carrying, their songs and cries drifting across fields that seemed to have no end. The wealth generated by this system was staggering. Mississippi's planters sent millions of bales of cotton downriver to New Orleans, from there to Liverpool and beyond, fueling the world's industrial revolution. By 1860, Mississippi was the nation's leading cotton producer. In that year alone, it produced over 1 million bales, feeding looms from Boston to Manchester. The statistics tell a story as stark as it is brutal. By the eve of the Civil War, enslaved people made up more than half of Mississippi's population. In some counties, particularly in the Fertile Delta, the percentage was even higher, 70, sometimes 80%. The state was not just a slave-holding society, it was a black majority society, with white elites clinging to dominance through violence, law, and sheer force of will. Enslaved people built the wealth of Mississippi, yet they had no share in it, no recognition of their humanity within the system that profited from their labor. Daily life on plantations varied depending on size, crop yield, and the temperament of the enslaver, but everywhere it was defined by toil and control. Field hands worked from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week, planting, hoeing, and harvesting. Their labor was backbreaking, their living conditions harsh. Cabins were small, often overcrowded, with little more than dirt floors and basic furnishings. Food was rationed, cornmeal, pork, molasses, but often insufficient, forcing enslaved people to supplement their diets with gardens or foraging when possible. The overseer, often a white man hired to enforce discipline, carried the lash as a constant threat. Resistance was met with punishment, sometimes unspeakably brutal. Yet within this system of dehumanization, enslaved people found ways to resist, to endure, and to hold on to their dignity. They sang spirituals in the fields, songs that carried hidden meanings and secret hopes. They told stories, passed down oral traditions, and built communities of strength. Religion became a refuge, with Christianity infused with African rhythms and traditions, offering both solace and a coded language of freedom. Some resisted directly, by running away, by slowing down their work, by sabotaging tools, or in rare cases, by open rebellion. The story of slavery in Mississippi is not only one of oppression, but also of endurance. Every act of survival, every birth in bondage, every whispered prayer was an act of defiance against a system designed to erase humanity. At the pinnacle of this system stood Natchez, a city that became synonymous with wealth, luxury, and the arrogance of power. Perched on high bluffs above the Mississippi River, Natchez was the jewel of the Cotton Kingdom. Here, planters built mansions that rivaled the estates of European nobility. Greek Revival columns rose toward the sky. Chandeliers sparkled above ballrooms where the elite danced in silk and satin. Riverboats docked below, unloading goods and loading bales of cotton that would sail to the world. By the 1850s, Natchez boasted more millionaires per capita than any city in the United States. Its planters were not merely rich. They were among the richest people in the world. Yet this wealth was built on a foundation of human suffering. For every glittering ballroom, there were countless fields where enslaved hands bled raw from the cotton bolls. For every mansion, there were rows of slave cabins hidden in the shadows. The grandeur of Natchez was inseparable from the brutality of slavery. Still, the planters convinced themselves of their virtue. They spoke of a Southern way of life, of chivalry, of paternalism. They argued that slavery was not only an economic necessity, but a positive good, a system ordained by God and sanctioned by tradition. Ministers preached sermons defending it. Politicians wrote laws entrenching it. Every fiber of Mississippi's political, social, and economic life was woven with slavery's thread. The enslaved majority knew the truth. They knew that the wealth of Natchez and the rise of King Cotton were not miracles, but theft of their labor, their freedom, their very selves. And yet they endured, carving lives from the cracks of oppression, leaving behind a cultural legacy of resilience that Mississippi would one day have to reckon with. As the decades rolled on, the cotton boom reshaped Mississippi's landscape. Small farms gave way to sprawling plantations. The Natchez Trace became a corridor of trade and movement. Towns grew along river crossings, their economies tied directly to cotton prices in distant markets. Banks in New York and London invested heavily in Mississippi's cotton trade, binding the state into the larger web of global capitalism. Mississippi's elites wielded their wealth not only at home, but on the national stage, pressing for policies that would protect and expand slavery. They saw in their fields not just cotton, but political power. By the 1830s and 1840s, Mississippi had become a microcosm of the South's contradictions: immense wealth for a few, deep poverty for many whites, and bondage for a black majority. Politics revolved around land speculation, banking crises, and always the defense of slavery. In 1837, the state's economy collapsed during a nationwide financial panic, leaving banks bankrupt and planters desperate. Yet even then, slavery did not waver. Cotton prices fell and rose again, but the system remained intact, sustained by violence and by the belief that there was no alternative. For the enslaved, the passage of time brought little relief. Families continued to be separated as people were sold further west, into new territories opening for cotton. The domestic slave trade flourished, with Mississippi at its center. Natchez's Forks of the Road Market became one of the largest slave markets in the South, where human beings were inspected, auctioned, and sold in numbers that shocked the conscience. And yet, despite everything, enslaved communities preserved their humanity. They married, though the law refused to recognize their unions. They raised children with hope that one day freedom would come. They cultivated music, language, and traditions that would outlast the system that tried to crush them. As the 1850s dawned, Mississippi stood at the height of its cotton power. It was prosperous, proud, and deeply invested in the institution of slavery. But beneath the surface, tensions were growing. The enslaved majority longed for freedom. The white elite feared its loss. And in the North, voices were rising: abolitionists, politicians, ordinary citizens, who questioned whether a nation founded on liberty could long endure half free and half enslaved. Mississippi's leaders dismissed these voices. They believed their wealth and their way of life were too powerful, too essential to ever be threatened. They looked out across their endless cotton fields and saw permanence. But history was already moving against them. The very system that had made Mississippi rich was pulling the nation toward a reckoning. Cotton had made Mississippi a giant. Slavery had made it possible. But giants can fall. And the seeds of that fall were already sown in the soil, alongside the cotton that gleamed so brightly under the southern sun. Chapter 5. The Fires of Secession. By the mid-1850s, Mississippi had wrapped itself so tightly in the cotton curtain of the Deep South that it could no longer imagine a future without slavery. It was not simply an economic system. It was the foundation of society, politics, and power. Cotton fields stretched from horizon to horizon, and every bulb picked was another stitch in a fabric of wealth that clothed the white elite in confidence and fear. fear that this system might end. Fear that the North, with its growing abolitionist movement and rising industrial economy, might one day force change upon them. That fear would become fire, and that fire would ignite one of the most defining chapters in Mississippi's history. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 sent shockwaves through the South. He had not appeared on the ballot in Mississippi. No one in the state had voted for him. And yet now, he would lead the nation. A man who opposed the expansion of slavery had gained the presidency without a single Southern vote. To many Mississippians, it was a sign, not just of political defeat, but of existential danger. If the federal government could now be dominated by a free state majority, what future did slave states have in this union? The response was swift, decisive, and fiery. On January 9, 1861, just 2 months after Lincoln's election, Mississippi became the second state to secede from the Union, following South Carolina by just 3 weeks. The vote at the state secession convention in Jackson was not close. 84 in favor, 15 against. The majority of delegates believed they were defending their rights, their economy, and their very way of life. In their declaration of secession, they made their reasoning painfully clear. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. There was no ambiguity. Slavery was not a side issue or a symptom. It was the cause. Mississippi's secession was a defense of a system that had made a few rich, enslaved hundreds of thousands, and now threatened to fracture a nation. The fires of secession had been lit, and Mississippi stood at the center of the blaze. War came quickly. In April, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Union responded. Mississippi, now part of the new Confederate States of America, began mobilizing for battle. Planters offered their sons. Towns raised regiments. The state's young men, raised on tales of honor and state pride, marched off to war with banners flying and drums beating. They believed it would be a short fight. They believed in the righteousness of their cause. But the war would be longer, bloodier, and more devastating than anyone could have imagined. From the beginning, Mississippi was both a contributor to the Confederate war effort and a target of Union strategy. Its central position along the Mississippi River made it a geographical prize. Whoever controlled the river controlled the movement of troops and supplies. And so, as Union generals crafted their plans, the city of Vicksburg emerged as a key objective. Perched high on bluffs overlooking the river, Vicksburg was known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. It was heavily fortified, fiercely defended, and absolutely vital. But before the siege of Vicksburg would come, other battles bloodied Mississippi soil. In 1862, the small town of Corinth, located in the northeastern corner of the state near the Tennessee border, became the site of one of the most significant early confrontations in the Western theater. The Battle of Corinth followed the earlier and even bloodier clash at Shiloh, just across the state line. Corinth was a strategic railroad junction, and both Union and Confederate forces understood its importance. In October 1862, Union forces under General William Rosecrans faced off against Confederate troops led by Earl Van Dorn. The fighting was fierce, urban, and chaotic. Soldiers battled in streets and alleys, firing from behind buildings and fences. In just 2 days, over 4,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The Union held the town, and the loss further weakened the Confederacy's grip on northern Mississippi. But the war was not just measured in battles. It was measured in suffering. As armies marched and raided, civilians bore the cost. Homes were burned, crops were trampled or stolen. Enslaved people fled to Union lines where possible, seizing their chance at freedom. But for most Mississippians, black and white alike, the war brought hunger, disease, and uncertainty. Confederate currency lost its value. Blockades strangled trade, churches were turned into hospitals. The very fabric of daily life unraveled. And then came Vicksburg. For nearly 2 years, Union commanders had tried to take the city. All had failed. The river was still closed to Union traffic. The Confederacy's eastern and western halves were still connected. But in 1863, a new general arrived, Ulysses S. Grant. He was methodical, relentless, and unafraid to gamble. He launched a bold campaign that would become a masterpiece of military strategy. Grant's forces marched down the western bank of the Mississippi River, crossed south of Vicksburg, and began moving north. They captured Jackson, the state capital, disrupting Confederate communications and supply lines. Then they turned west and encircled Vicksburg itself. From May 18th to July 4th, 1863, the siege of Vicksburg ground on. Union artillery bombarded the city day and night. Food supplies dwindled, civilians hid in caves dug into the hillsides. Rats became a delicacy. Disease spread like wildfire. Confederate troops, trapped and exhausted, held out as long as they could. Finally, on July 4th, the Confederate commander, John C. Pemberton, surrendered. Grant took 30,000 prisoners and gained full control of the Mississippi River. The victory at Vicksburg, coming just 1 day after the Union triumph at Gettysburg, marked a turning point in the war. The Confederacy was now cut in two. The river was Union territory, and Mississippi, once the backbone of Southern strength, had been broken. The fall of Vicksburg devastated Confederate morale, but the war dragged on for nearly 2 more years. Mississippi became a corridor for raids, skirmishes, and retreat. Sherman's forces, after capturing Atlanta, marched through Georgia and then turned north, leaving destruction in their wake. Smaller towns and farms throughout Mississippi were looted or burned. The landscape, once dominated by orderly rows of cotton, was scarred by fire and ruin. Meanwhile, the social order that had defined Mississippi for decades began to collapse. As Union armies advanced, enslaved people fled in droves, seeking the lines of blue-coated soldiers. Some joined the Union Army, serving in the United States colored troops. Others formed refugee camps near Union forts. Though freedom was no guarantee of safety, many faced disease, hunger, or exploitation. It was still freedom. The system that had once seemed unbreakable was falling apart. For white Mississippians, especially those of the planter class, the collapse was both economic and existential. Their wealth vanished with the Confederacy's currency. Their labor force walked away. Their sons died in distant fields. By 1865, Mississippi was a shell of its former self. The cities were damaged, the railroads destroyed, the fields lay fallow or overgrown. Hunger was everywhere. Yet the war was not just a physical destruction, it was a psychic one. The surrender at Appomattox in April 1865 ended the fighting, but it did not end the pain. Mississippi had sent nearly 80,000 men to fight for the Confederacy. Over 27,000 would never return. The war had claimed not just lives, but futures. Entire communities had been emptied. Widows outnumbered brides, orphans filled the state's care. and the social structure that had once placed white men at the top and black men and women in chains was now shattered, legally, if not yet culturally. Mississippi's place in the new Union would not be easily accepted. For many, the end of the war felt like occupation, not liberation. Union troops remained in garrison. Federal agents monitored elections. The Freedmen's Bureau, established to aid newly freed people, faced constant resistance. Reconstruction was on the horizon, but in Mississippi, the war's fires still smoldered. Looking back, the Civil War was not merely a chapter in Mississippi's history, it was a crucible. The fires of secession had promised glory and independence. Instead, they brought devastation and defeat. Mississippi, once a leader in leaving the Union, now lay in ruins within it. And yet, out of those ashes, something new would have to emerge. But what that would be, who would build it, who would lead it, and who would be allowed to share in it, was still an open question. Chapter 6: Reconstruction and Redemption. In the spring of 1865, as the war-weary Confederacy crumbled into dust and Union troops marched through the ruins of southern cities, Mississippi stood at a crossroads, defeated, defiant, and uncertain. The cotton fields lay silent, the economy in tatters, the plantations hollowed out like husks. Slavery, the system that had propped up the state's power, wealth, and identity, was dead. And yet, what would rise in its place was far from clear. In the vacuum left behind by war, Mississippi entered an era of radical possibility and violent resistance, an age marked by the fragile hope of freedom and the furious backlash that sought to crush it. This was the age of Reconstruction and Redemption. The end of the Civil War brought more than surrender. It brought the 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, which abolished slavery in the United States. In theory, nearly half of Mississippi's population, over 430,000 formerly enslaved men, women, and children, were now free. But in practice, that freedom came wrapped in chains of uncertainty. Free, yes, but free to do what? Free to live where? To earn how? The land still belonged to the white planter class. The laws, the courts, the militias, all remained in white hands. And in Mississippi, freedom would not be given room to grow without a fight. In the earliest days after the war, the federal government attempted to manage the chaos through the Freedmen's Bureau, a temporary agency tasked with helping newly freed people adjust to life outside of bondage. It set up schools, negotiated labor contracts, provided food and basic health care, and tried, however imperfectly, to impose some form of justice in a land that had long denied it. For thousands of black Mississippians, this was the first time they had access to education, legal protection, and government recognition. Small victories blossomed. Churches were founded, communities built, families reunited. And for a moment, it seemed that a new Mississippi might take root. One built not on the backs of the enslaved, but on the promises of equality. But not everyone welcomed that vision. The white population of Mississippi, particularly the former planter elite, viewed Reconstruction not as healing, but as humiliation. Their old world had died on the battlefield, and now they feared its replacement. Many resented the presence of federal troops and bureau agents. They despised the idea of black men voting, serving on juries, or holding office. And so, even before the ink was dry on the surrender documents, they began building the machinery to reclaim their power. In the fall of 1865, Mississippi became the first state to pass a set of laws known as the Black Codes. These were not laws of equality. They were laws of control, designed to recreate slavery in all but name. Black Mississippians were required to sign labor contracts with white employers, often under threat of arrest. Vagrancy laws allowed local officials to imprison those without employment and lease them out to private labor. Apprenticeship laws gave white guardians control over black children. In essence, these codes sought to freeze the newly freed population in place, tied to the land, stripped of autonomy, bound to serve once again. But the tide of federal politics was shifting. In 1867, Congress, frustrated by the leniency of President Andrew Johnson and alarmed by Southern resistance, imposed radical Reconstruction. Mississippi was placed under military rule. The black codes were repealed. New elections were held. And for the first time in state history, black men cast their votes and held public office. Between 1869 and 1875, Mississippi experienced an extraordinary transformation. Black Mississippians were elected to local councils, school boards, and even the state legislature. Hiram Revels, a free-born black minister from Natchez, was appointed in 1870 as the first African American to serve in the U.S. Senate, filling the seat once held by Jefferson Davis. For a brief and shining moment, the political landscape of Mississippi reflected the diversity of its people. But that light came at a cost. As black political power rose, so did the rage of those who opposed it. White supremacists, unwilling to accept the new order, turned to terror. In the dead of night, men in white robes and hoods rode through the countryside, burning schools, beating teachers, intimidating voters, and lynching those who dared to challenge the old hierarchy. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in Tennessee in 1866, quickly spread across Mississippi. It was not a fringe movement. It was a campaign of organized racial terror, often supported or tolerated by local authorities. The goal was simple: to destroy Reconstruction by fear. And it worked. By the mid-1870s, the political winds began to shift again. Northern support for Reconstruction waned. Economic depression in the North made people less interested in the South's problems. And in Mississippi, white Democrats regrouped under a new banner: redemption. They promised to restore law and order, to end what they called Negro rule, and to return the state to white leadership. Their methods were both legal and violent. Voter suppression, intimidation, and outright fraud plagued elections. In the 1875 election, known as the Mississippi Plan, Democratic paramilitary groups openly threatened black voters and Republican candidates. The federal government, unwilling to intervene decisively, stood by as the Redeemers took back the state. By 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, marking the end of Reconstruction. Mississippi had been redeemed, but what followed was not justice. It was retrenchment. The new Democratic government quickly set about reversing the gains of the previous decade. Black officials were removed or defeated. Schools were defunded. The few legal protections that had been won were quietly erased. And in their place rose a new legal system, one that would come to define the next century of Southern life. This system came to be known as Jim Crow, a name borrowed from a racist minstrel caricature that soon became synonymous with legal segregation. But in Mississippi, Jim Crow was not just about separate water fountains or train cars. It was about power and the total removal of black citizens from the political process. The foundation of this removal came in 1890, when Mississippi convened a new state constitutional convention. On the surface, the goal was reform. In reality, it was disenfranchisement. The delegates introduced a series of new voting requirements: poll taxes, literacy tests, residency clauses, and understanding clauses. Each was carefully designed to exclude black voters without explicitly mentioning race. And it worked. In the years following the new Constitution, black voter registration in Mississippi dropped from over 100,000 to fewer than 9,000. The political voice of half the state's population was silenced. But if Jim Crow ruled the legal system, another force ruled the economy: sharecropping. After emancipation, most freedmen had little more than the clothes on their backs. They owned no land, had no capital, and few opportunities. The dream of 40 acres and a mule had never materialized. So, many turned to a system that offered at least the promise of independence, working as tenant farmers on land owned by white planters. Under the sharecropping system, black families would farm a portion of land in exchange for a share of the crop, usually half. In theory, it offered autonomy. In reality, it was a trap. Landowners provided seed, tools, and sometimes food on credit, but at exorbitant rates. At harvest, they kept the books, decided the prices, and often claimed that the tenant owed more than they had earned. Debts rolled over from season to season. Families became tied to the land in a cycle of poverty, unable to leave, unable to advance. It was a new form of bondage, dressed in the clothes of freedom. And it was not just black farmers who suffered. Poor white farmers, too, were drawn into sharecropping, though they were often granted more favorable terms. A caste system emerged, rigid and racial, designed to keep wealth and land in the hands of the few. Still, amid the hardship, black communities fought to survive and to build. Churches became centers of strength, not just for worship, but for organizing, education, and resistance. Schools, often funded and built by the freedmen themselves, sprouted in every corner of the state. Teachers, many of them formerly enslaved, carried the torch of literacy into the darkness of Jim Crow. Families pooled resources. Musicians turned sorrow into spirituals, and later into the blues. And even though the ballot had been stripped away, the longing for justice never died. By the dawn of the 20th century, Mississippi had remade itself. The planters had regained their power. The black population had been pushed to the margins. Segregation was law. Voter rolls were white. And the Confederate flag, once a battlefield banner, now hung over courthouses and schools. The war had ended, but the struggle had not. Reconstruction had offered a glimpse of what Mississippi could become: a state of shared power, rising from the ashes of slavery. But redemption ensured that the dream would be deferred, and Jim Crow would stretch its shadow across another century. Yet even in that shadow, the fires of resistance burned quietly, waiting for their time to rise again. Chapter 7: The Delta Blues and the New Century. As the sun rose on the 20th century, Mississippi remained a place suspended between worlds, rooted in the memory of its plantation past, yet moving slowly, painfully, into the machinery of modernity. The cotton fields still stretched wide and white across the delta, but beneath the surface, the old order was cracking. Railroads pushed deeper into rural counties. Towns grew, if modestly. Automobiles appeared on the dirt roads, and electricity hummed to life in courthouses and train depots. But for most Mississippians, especially those bound by race and poverty, life had not changed much at all. Jim Crow ruled with quiet cruelty, and cotton was still king. But a new voice was rising from the fields and juke joints. a sound that would echo far beyond the red clay banks of the Mississippi River. It began in the Delta. The Mississippi Delta was not the mouth of the river, as many imagine, but a wide, flat, alluvial plain stretching from Memphis in the north to Vicksburg in the south, bounded by the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers. Its soil was among the richest in the world, dark and deep, capable of growing cotton like nowhere else. And yet, it was also a land of grinding poverty, where sharecroppers toiled from sunrise to dusk, bending over rows of cotton with sore backs and calloused hands. Black families, still shackled by the legacy of slavery, lived in wooden shacks on white-owned land, earning little, owing much, and moving only when driven by desperation or hope. From this hardship emerged something extraordinary: the blues. No one can say precisely when the blues was born. It was not composed in a moment or by a single man. It rose gradually, organically, from the collective memory of a people who had endured slavery, segregation, and sorrow, and who needed a way to tell the truth. It was music of loneliness, longing, defiance, and love. It carried the spirituals of slavery into a new age and fused them with the rhythm of labor, the moan of trains, and the heartbeat of the South. In the early 1900s, itinerant musicians wandered from town to town, carrying guitars or harmonicas and trading songs for coins, drinks, or a warm bed. They played on porches, in cotton camps, at house parties, and in dusty juke joints where Saturday nights blurred into Sunday mornings. The blues was oral, personal, immediate, sung to neighbors, not crowds. It wasn't yet a genre. It was life turned into sound. One of the earliest known bluesmen was Charlie Patton, born near Edwards and raised at Dockery Plantation near Ruleville, a place many consider the birthplace of the Delta blues. Patton's voice was raw, raspy, and full of power. He strummed with a violence that matched the harshness of the world around him. Others followed: Son House, with his mournful slide guitar; Skip James, with his eerie falsetto; and eventually Robert Johnson, whose haunted recordings from the 1930s would later earn him mythic status. Legend claimed he met the devil at a crossroads and traded his soul for guitar mastery. Whether true or not, Johnson's influence was real, and his songs, like Crossroad Blues and Hellhound on My Trail, captured the despair and desperation that clung to the Delta like summer heat. The blues was more than music. It was resistance. In a world that silenced black voices, the blues sang freely. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't need approval. It spoke of cheating lovers, cruel bosses, floods, hunger, and dreams. It gave the powerless a language that could not be censored. And as the 20th century wore on, the blues began to travel. First north, with the people who carried it, and later across the world, into clubs, radios, and record stores. While the blues soared in sound, Mississippi remained chained in structure. Segregation defined every aspect of public life. After the 1890 Constitution had disenfranchised most black voters, a series of laws and customs hardened the racial divide into law. Schools were separated by race, with black children crammed into underfunded buildings, given second-hand books, and often forced to leave early for planting and picking seasons. Public transportation had whites-only sections. Restaurants, restrooms, even cemeteries were divided by color. The law called it separate but equal, but everyone knew that only the separation was real. In small towns and cities, black Mississippians built parallel institutions, churches, lodges, businesses, and newspapers. But they lived under the constant threat of humiliation and violence. A wrong look, a missed "sir," or a challenge to authority could lead to a beating, or worse. Lynchings were not hidden crimes, but public spectacles. Between 1900 and 1940, dozens of black Mississippians were murdered by mobs with impunity, often with the silent approval of local law enforcement. The message was clear. The old order would be preserved, no matter the cost. For many, the only hope lay elsewhere. And so began the Great Migration. Starting in the 1910s and accelerating through the 1920s and 30s, waves of black Mississippians began to leave. They packed bags, boarded trains, and headed north to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and beyond. They left behind the fields, the fear, and the laws that had governed every part of their lives. In the North, jobs in factories and slaughterhouses offered better wages and, in theory, a freer life. In Mississippi, a black man could not vote. In Chicago, he could. In Mississippi, speaking out meant danger. In Detroit, it meant possibility. By the mid-20th century, over 400,000 black Mississippians had joined the Great Migration. It was one of the largest internal movements of people in American history. They carried with them their traditions, their resilience, and their music. The blues found new homes in northern bars and clubs, amplified and electrified. Muddy Waters, born in Rolling Fork, learned slide guitar on the Delta but made his name in Chicago. B.B. King, raised near Indianola, would carry the blues around the world. But Mississippi, though emptier of voices, did not forget those who left. The loss hollowed out communities. Schools closed, churches shrank. Yet the legacy of those who left would return in echoes. Through music, literature, and later, in the political power of a northern black middle class built from southern roots. Back home, the land itself seemed to rebel. Cotton had been king for generations, but the soil was weary, and technology had begun to change the rhythms of agriculture. The boll weevil, a small insect native to Central America, invaded Mississippi fields in the 1900s and spread quickly, devastating crops. By the 1920s, cotton yields plummeted. Small farmers, black and white, suffered terribly. With few options, many fell deeper into debt, while large planters consolidated land and turned increasingly to mechanization. Then came the flood. In the spring of 1927, after months of rain and swollen rivers, the Mississippi River broke loose. Levees failed. Water poured over the delta like judgment. 27,000 square miles were submerged. Over 200,000 people were displaced in Mississippi alone, most of them black sharecroppers who had no warning, no transportation, and nowhere to go. Families climbed onto rooftops or fled to makeshift refugee camps on high ground. Livestock drowned. Homes vanished. Entire towns disappeared underwater. The federal response, led by Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, brought national attention. But relief was unequal. In the segregated refugee camps, white refugees were fed and housed with some dignity, while black refugees were often forced into labor camps guarded by armed men. The plantation elite, fearing labor loss, used the crisis to tighten control, keeping black workers on the land even as their homes floated away. The flood of 1927 was one of the greatest natural disasters in American history. But it was more than an act of God. It exposed the deep racial and economic fractures of the Mississippi system. It showed how poverty turned disaster into devastation. And it triggered a second wave of migration, as many who had stayed now resolved to leave for good. Yet, even in the midst of ruin, Mississippi remained a place of creativity and culture. The blues continued to evolve. Gospel choirs lifted voices in wooden churches. Writers began to take notice of the stories buried in the soil. A young William Faulkner, raised in Oxford, would soon transform Mississippi's tortured history into literary gold. He wrote not of heroes, but of haunted families, blood-soaked legacies, and a land that refused to forget. His fiction, dense, painful, and unflinching, reflected the truth. Mississippi was not just a place on a map, but a condition of the soul. As the 1940s approached, war loomed again. The Great Depression had hollowed out the economy. Many Mississippians, white and black, had joined the New Deal programs, building roads, bridges, and post offices. Yet segregation remained untouched, and injustice endured. World War II would soon call thousands into uniform, reshaping lives and expectations. But the roots of the modern civil rights movement, the demand for dignity, equality, and recognition, were already being planted in the muddy fields of the Delta and the minds of those who had known hunger, exile, and silence. Mississippi had entered the new century battered by history, but still alive with music, memory, and meaning. It was a land of contradictions, where suffering birthed beauty and silence gave rise to song. The blues was not just a musical style. It was Mississippi's true anthem, born from pain, played by memory, and carried always toward a better day. Chapter 8. Civil Rights Ground Zero. By the middle of the 20th century, the cracks in Mississippi's carefully controlled racial order had begun to widen. The old systems, segregation, disenfranchisement, intimidation, still held power, but beneath the surface, pressure was building. Black Mississippians had endured generations of inequality, exclusion, and violence. They had built communities, churches, schools, and businesses in the shadows of Jim Crow, surviving where others might have broken. But now, the winds of change were stirring, not just in courtrooms and capitals, but in classrooms, cotton fields, and city streets. And nowhere in America would that coming struggle burn more fiercely than in Mississippi. In 1955, a boy arrived in the Delta. His name was Emmett Till, a 14-year-old from Chicago. He was visiting relatives in the small town of Money, Mississippi, a patch of land in the cotton country where time still moved at the pace of the plow. Emmett was lively, curious, and full of the confidence of a boy raised in a northern city, where the lines of segregation were present but not carved so deeply. In Mississippi, those lines were etched in blood. One afternoon, Emmett reportedly whistled at a white woman named Carolyn Bryant while inside a local store. In another place, it might have been brushed off as teenage mischief. In Mississippi, it was a death sentence. Days later, two white men, Roy Bryant and J.W. Mealum, kidnapped Emmett from his great-uncle's home. They beat him, shot him in the head, and dumped his body into the Tallahatchie River, weighted down with a cotton gin fan tied to his neck with barbed wire. When his body was found, bloated and disfigured, the country recoiled. His mother, Mamie Till Mobley, made the courageous decision to hold an open casket funeral in Chicago. "I want the world to see what they did to my boy," she said, and they did. The photographs of Emmett's body, published in black newspapers and magazines, ignited a national outcry. The violence that black Mississippians had endured in silence for generations had found a face, and that face belonged to a child. The trial that followed was a grim performance of Southern injustice. Despite overwhelming evidence and national scrutiny, An all-white, all-male jury acquitted the killers in under an hour. Months later, safe from further prosecution due to double jeopardy laws, the men admitted to the crime in a paid magazine interview. Their confession was chilling, but not surprising. In Mississippi, white supremacy did not hide. It strutted in the open, confident that the system would protect it. But this time, the world had been watching, and the world would not forget. If Emmett Till's murder was a spark, Medgar Evers was the flame that refused to go out. Born in Decatur, Mississippi, and a World War II veteran, Evers returned home to a state that still denied him basic rights. But he did not turn away. Instead, he became the first field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, dedicating his life to challenging segregation, fighting for black voting rights, and demanding accountability in a land where justice was rare. Evers organized boycotts of segregated businesses, investigated lynchings, and fought to enroll black students in Mississippi's all-white universities. He became a fixture of the movement, respected, targeted, and unyielding. But his work made him a marked man. On the night of June 12, 1963, hours after President John F. Kennedy delivered a televised speech calling civil rights a moral issue, Medgar Evers was shot in the back in the driveway of his Jackson home. He died less than an hour later. His killer, a white supremacist named Byron de la Beckwith, was arrested and tried and, like Till's killers, acquitted by all-white juries. The message was clear. In Mississippi, fighting for freedom could still cost you your life, and your killers could still walk free. But Medgar Evers' death did not silence the movement. It strengthened it. Thousands attended his funeral. National leaders took notice, and the fight only grew louder. Nowhere was that fight more visible than in Oxford, home to the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss. For decades, the campus had been a bastion of whiteness, tradition, and resistance to change. But in 1962, a quiet revolution walked through its gates in the form of one man, James Meredith. A native Mississippian and an Air Force veteran, Meredith applied to Ole Miss not just to get a degree, but to make a point. He wanted to break the color line. Backed by the NAACP and armed with a legal victory in federal court, Meredith had the right to enroll. But the state of Mississippi, led by Governor Ross Barnett, was determined to stop him. For days, the standoff built tension like a gathering storm. Barnett made public speeches defending segregation, while the federal government, under President Kennedy, tried to negotiate peace. But peace never came. On the night of September 30th, 1962, as Meredith prepared to enter campus under federal protection, violence exploded. White mobs, many of them outsiders, gathered with bricks, guns, and hatred. They attacked federal marshals, torched vehicles, and fired into the night. 2 people were killed. Hundreds were injured. The next morning, under the watch of U.S. Army troops, James Meredith walked onto campus and became the first black student to enroll at the University of Mississippi. The riots at Ole Miss shocked the nation. Images of soldiers with bayonets on a southern campus evoked comparisons to war zones. And in many ways, it was a war, a battle for the soul of the South. Fought not just with laws and marches, but with blood and resolve. Meredith's bravery shattered the illusion that segregation could be preserved peacefully. It was a fight, and the fight was far from over. As the 1960s progressed, Mississippi became the central battleground of the civil rights movement. It was the proving ground, the place where strategies were tested Courage was measured, and brutality revealed itself without disguise. In 1964, civil rights organizers launched an ambitious campaign known as Freedom Summer. Their goal was simple in theory, but revolutionary in practice: register black voters in Mississippi. That summer, hundreds of volunteers, many of them white college students from the North, descended on the state to set up freedom schools, organize community centers, and challenge the Democratic Party's whites-only structure. They worked alongside seasoned activists from groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, the Congress of Racial Equality, CR, and the NAACP. The risks were enormous. Within weeks, the cost became clear. On June 21, 1964, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, a black Mississippian, and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, 2 white New Yorkers, went missing near Philadelphia, Mississippi. For weeks, their fate remained unknown. Their burned-out car was found abandoned, and their names became national headlines. President Lyndon Johnson ordered an FBI investigation. Finally, after 44 days, their bodies were discovered buried in an earthen dam. They had been murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan, with the involvement of local law enforcement. The killings stunned the country and revealed the lengths to which white supremacists would go to preserve their grip on power. Yet, even in mourning, the movement pressed on. That fall, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, an interracial delegation led by activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, challenged the legitimacy of the state's all-white delegation at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. Hamer, a former sharecropper who had been jailed and beaten for trying to register to vote, delivered a televised speech that pierced the conscience of the nation. "Is this America?" she asked. "The land of the free and the home of the brave." Though the MFDP was not seated, their efforts exposed the deep rot of segregationist politics and laid the groundwork for future victories. And victories did come. In 1965, in response to the brutality of Freedom Summer and the growing national demand for change, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which struck down literacy tests and empowered federal oversight of elections in states like Mississippi. Slowly, black voter registration began to climb. Black Mississippians ran for office. Churches became organizing hubs, and a new generation of leaders stepped forward. But progress was never smooth. Mississippi's resistance to integration remained fierce. Schools, though legally desegregated, remained divided in practice. Economic opportunity was still limited. Violence still simmered. Yet, the days when white supremacy could operate unchallenged had passed. The nation had seen Mississippi for what it was, and also for what it could become. Through it all, federal intervention remained essential. It was not just marches and speeches that broke the back of Jim Crow, but court orders, U.S. Marshals, and the threat of federal troops. The myth of states' rights had long been used to justify segregation. But by the 1970s, the federal government had claimed a new role as enforcer of civil rights, not just protector of state sovereignty. Mississippi's story during this era is not simply one of injustice. It is one of courage, the bravery of young organizers who risked everything to register voters, the defiance of parents who sent their children into newly integrated schools, the quiet strength of those who faced violence with dignity, and the legacy of those who never lived to see the world they dreamed of. By the end of the 1970s, Mississippi had changed, though incompletely. The Klan was no longer a public force. segregation had been stripped from the law, if not always from practice. Black Mississippians were voting, organizing, and leading. But the scars of the past remained. The fields still whispered the songs of the enslaved. The cemetery still held the fallen heroes of the fight, and the legacy of resistance, of those who dared to dream of justice in the face of terror, remained etched into the soil. Mississippi had been the crucible of the American Civil Rights Movement. Ground Zero, the place where the Old South made its last stand, and where a new South struggled to be born. The battles fought here, on dusty roads, courtroom steps, and in the hearts of ordinary people, reshaped the nation. But history never ends with a single chapter. The fight for equality had been won in law, but not yet in life. And Mississippi's journey, like the country's, would continue, haunted by the past, but lit by the courage of those who refused to surrender. Chapter 9. Politics, Progress, and Pain. As the 1970s dawned, Mississippi stood at a crossroads once again. The civil rights movement had forced change upon the state, but those changes had not yet settled into the bones of its institutions. Segregation had been outlawed, yes. Discrimination had been challenged, marched against, and litigated. But the systems that had supported racial inequality for over a century didn't collapse overnight. They adapted, shifted, and, in many ways, persisted in new forms. In the years following the landmark civil rights legislation of the 1960s, Mississippi entered a period of uneasy transition. Federal court orders demanded desegregation of schools, but compliance came slowly and with resistance. In rural counties and city school districts alike, white families withdrew from public education, founding private segregation academies that allowed them to continue schooling their children apart from black students. These schools, often with religious affiliations, sprouted across the state during the 1970s, protected by a legal gray area and subsidized by private donations. Though desegregation was the law, in practice, Mississippi's classrooms remained divided, not by statute, but by strategy. Still, the legal victories of the civil rights movement had left behind new political ground, and in that ground, something powerful began to grow. For the first time since Reconstruction, black political leadership began to emerge again in Mississippi, not as symbolic figures, but as real representatives of real communities. The Voting Rights Act had opened the door, and now black Mississippians were walking through it. In 1970, Charles Evers, brother of the slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers, made history when he was elected mayor of Fayette, a small town in Jefferson County. He became the first black mayor of a racially integrated town in Mississippi since Reconstruction. His victory was both a local event and a national symbol. It suggested that the black vote could not only be counted, it could count for something. Charles Evers used his platform boldly, speaking bluntly about race, justice, and the unfinished work of his brother's generation. Though his tenure would be rocky and controversial, his election cracked open a door that had long been sealed shut. Others soon followed. Across the state, black Mississippians began winning seats on city councils, school boards, and in the state legislature. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Mississippi had one of the highest numbers of elected black officials in the country. Men and women who had once been denied the right to even enter the courthouse were now writing laws inside it. And yet, while the symbols of progress were undeniable, the deeper structures of power remained largely intact. Mississippi's economy, long dependent on agriculture, was shifting beneath its feet. Mechanization had reduced the need for manual labor in the cotton fields. Sharecropping had declined, but nothing fully replaced it. Factories opened, then closed. Timber and catfish farming rose as regional industries, but they couldn't absorb all the displaced labor. The state's urban centers, Jackson, Meridian, Hattiesburg, Gulfport, grew modestly, but not enough to prevent a growing sense of economic stagnation, especially in the Delta and other rural areas. Black communities, disproportionately poor due to generations of structural exclusion, were hardest hit. In response, the state government pushed for economic development initiatives, offering tax breaks to attract industry, investing in highways and infrastructure, and promoting tourism rooted in Southern nostalgia. Some towns found lifelines through cultural heritage, particularly around blues music. But for every new museum or factory, there were still shuttered schools, failing hospitals, and rural counties where poverty clung like humidity in August. The challenge of education remained central. Mississippi had long ranked near the bottom in national comparisons of public school funding, literacy rates, and academic performance. While federal desegregation orders had led to some improvement in integration, the disparities in resources between white and black communities were still striking. Reform efforts came and went. Some governors pushed for new investments. Others campaigned on promises to cut taxes and reduce government interference. The battle over public education in Mississippi became a mirror for the deeper struggle over who the state wanted to be. At the same time, a different set of institutions was expanding rapidly. Prisons. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, Mississippi, like many other southern states, embraced tough-on-crime policies that led to a dramatic increase in incarceration. Mandatory minimum sentences, the war on drugs, and harsh parole laws filled the state's prisons at unprecedented rates. The opening of the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman, a prison plantation with a dark legacy stretching back to Reconstruction, became symbolic of a wider trend. The criminal justice system replacing slavery and Jim Crow as the primary means of racial control. By the 1990s, Mississippi had one of the highest incarceration rates in the nation, with black men disproportionately affected. Families were fractured. Entire generations grew up with the threat of prison looming over them. Prisons became big business, employing guards, building contractors, and prison towns dependent on incarceration for economic survival. In rural counties where schools struggled for funding, prisons received new buildings, state contracts, and political protection. And yet, through all of this, through the broken promises of desegregation, the slow rise of black leadership, the collapse of the rural economy, and the expansion of the prison state, Mississippi continued to evolve. In the cultural realm, Mississippi remained a paradox, one of the poorest states in the nation, yet one of the richest in artistic legacy. Writers like Eudora Welty, born in Jackson, offered stories steeped in the complexity of Southern identity. Playwright Beth Henley brought Mississippi's dark humor and dysfunction to Broadway. Meanwhile, the blues, once confined to back porches and juke joints, was now recognized as one of America's greatest musical exports. Blues legends were celebrated in Europe and Japan. Museums opened. Road signs dotted the highways of the Delta, marking the places where Robert Johnson once stood, where Muddy Waters had been born. The same fields that once echoed with slave songs now welcome tourists from around the world, eager to touch the roots of American music. And in Jackson, the capital city, Malaco Records became a hub for soul, gospel, and blues revival, bridging generations of musicians and bringing their stories into the national spotlight. Yet, identity remained contested. Mississippi still bore the symbols of its Confederate past, most notably in its state flag, which, until the year 2020, carried the Confederate battle emblem in its corner. For many, it was heritage. For others, it was hate. The debate over the flag stretched back decades, flaring during political campaigns and public protests, but never fully resolved. It symbolized the deeper question that haunted Mississippi in the late 20th century. Was the state moving forward or clinging to ghosts? The political landscape also continued to shift. In 1986, Mike Espy, a black lawyer from Yazoo City, was elected to Congress representing Mississippi's 2nd District. He was the first African American from Mississippi elected to the U.S. House since Reconstruction. His victory signaled the growing political influence of black Mississippians, especially in the Delta. In 1993, Espy was appointed Secretary of Agriculture by President Bill Clinton, becoming the first black person to hold that cabinet position. His rise reflected not just personal achievement, but the long arc of struggle, from exclusion to inclusion, from protest to policy. At the local level, black mayors, police chiefs, and school superintendents increasingly served in towns and cities across the state. Many of them elected in majority black districts, shaped by the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. But their work was not easy. They inherited underfunded institutions, polarized electorates, and the lingering legacies of inequality. Their presence was progress, but it was not a cure. By the end of the 1990s, Mississippi had changed in ways that would have once seemed unimaginable. Segregation as a legal system had been dismantled. Black citizens served in elected office. Cultural contributions from Mississippi's black communities were honored around the world. And yet, so much of the old pain remained. The Delta was still poor. Rural hospitals were still closing. Public schools still lagged behind national averages. And the divide between black and white, rich and poor, past and future, still shaped life in countless ways. What emerged in these decades was a new Mississippi, not yet fully formed. A state that no longer openly defended segregation, but struggled to fully embrace integration. A state where the symbols of the past still loomed large, but where new voices rose to challenge them. A state where blues music played on heritage trails, while prison bars clanged behind hidden hills. It was a place full of contradiction. Fiercely proud, deeply wounded, endlessly complex. Mississippi in the late 20th century was not what it had been, but it was not yet what it could be. The old order had been dismantled in law, but not entirely in life. Progress had come, but slowly, unevenly, and always with pain. Still, something had shifted. A younger generation had grown up knowing a different Mississippi, one where they could vote, where they could go to integrated schools, where they could question the past and imagine a different future. And that imagining, though fragile, was powerful. Because for all its pain, Mississippi had never lost its voice. It had sung through slavery. It had marched through segregation. It had spoken through the blues, prayed through the churches, and written through the novels. It had fought to be heard, and in doing so, helped to reshape the conscience of a nation. What came next would depend not just on history, but on memory. Not just on policy, but on people. People willing to reckon with the past and still believe in something better. Mississippi was still becoming, and its story, like its song, was not over yet. Chapter 10: Natural Disasters and New Challenges. At the turn of the 21st century, Mississippi carried with it the long shadows of a difficult past and the burden of a future not yet defined. The legacies of slavery, segregation, and economic hardship had shaped generations. But the state was also adapting. New industries were emerging, cities were growing, and young Mississippians, more connected to the world than ever before, were beginning to demand change. Yet, as always, history in Mississippi did not progress in straight lines. The early decades of the 2000s would bring fresh opportunities, but also fresh wounds. And in 2005, the storm that had long loomed over the Gulf would arrive with fury. Hurricane Katrina formed over the Bahamas in late August 2005, gathering strength as it moved west across the Gulf of Mexico. By the time it reached the coastline on August 29th, it had become one of the most powerful and destructive storms in American history. While much of the national attention focused on New Orleans and the failures of its levees, the Mississippi Gulf Coast bore the brunt of Katrina's most violent impact. In towns like Gulfport, Biloxi, Bay St. Louis, and Pascagoula, the wind gusts reached over 120 miles per hour, and the storm's surge, a wall of water as high as 30 feet, swallowed entire neighborhoods. In a matter of hours, entire communities were erased. Homes, schools, churches, businesses leveled. Historic districts, some dating back centuries, were reduced to debris. Concrete bridges twisted like paper. The beachfront casinos that had come to symbolize the region's economic rebirth were gutted or floated off their foundations. The storm surge pushed miles inland, flooding neighborhoods that had never before seen the sea. Thousands of residents were displaced. Many had evacuated before landfall, but tens of thousands had stayed behind, thinking they could ride it out. What they experienced was beyond imagination. Survivors told of clinging to rooftops, watching neighbors drown, and emerging from attics to find a sea where their street had been. The death toll in Mississippi reached 238, but the numbers told only part of the story. The true cost was measured in memory, in trauma, in a coastline that had to be rebuilt from ruin. The federal response in Mississippi, while faster than in neighboring Louisiana, still left many without shelter, clean water, or electricity for weeks. FEMA trailers lined parking lots and front yards. Insurance battles dragged on for years. Some towns recovered quickly, others never fully did. But in the wake of the storm, something more subtle took shape. A reckoning not just with nature, but with Mississippi's vulnerabilities, its fragile infrastructure, its economic dependence on narrow industries, and its deep social and racial divides. The Gulf Coast had, for decades, been a symbol of Mississippi's attempt to diversify beyond agriculture and manufacturing. Starting in the 1990s, the region had experienced an economic boom fueled by the rise of the casino industry. Legalized in 1992 with strict regulations that required casinos to be built over water. Towns like Biloxi and Gulfport became regional entertainment hubs, drawing tourists from neighboring states and generating millions in tax revenue. The bright lights and riverboat-style casinos offered a new image for Mississippi, one of opportunity and modernization. For a time it worked. Casinos brought jobs not only in gaming, but in construction, hospitality, and food service. State tax revenues increased. Local governments invested in roadwork, schools, and beautification projects. But the industry also carried risk. It was highly sensitive to tourism trends, weather events, and economic downturns. And when Katrina hit, The vulnerability of a water-based casino economy became devastatingly clear. In the years after the storm, regulations were revised to allow casinos to rebuild on land, recognizing the folly of mooring Mississippi's economic future to barges and stilts. Rebuilding was slow but determined. New casinos opened their doors, creating jobs and reviving tourism. By the late 2010s, the Gulf Coast was once again a symbol of recovery, with sparkling resorts, golf courses, and a reimagined beachfront. Yet the glitz masked deeper realities, particularly further inland, where poverty remained stubborn, wages low, and opportunity uneven. Away from the coast, rural Mississippi told a different story. While parts of Jackson, Tupelo, and Oxford saw investments in healthcare, education, and technology, many rural counties, especially in the Delta and along the Alabama border, continued to suffer from generational poverty, underemployment, and the slow erosion of infrastructure. Small towns lost grocery stores, gas stations, even schools. Factories closed or automated, hospitals downsized or vanished altogether, leaving entire counties without emergency rooms. One of the most persistent challenges was healthcare. Mississippi entered the 21st century with some of the nation's worst health outcomes: high rates of diabetes, heart disease, infant mortality, and obesity. Access to doctors was uneven. Rural clinics were often underfunded and understaffed. Mental health services were scarce. Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act became a political flashpoint. Mississippi's decision not to expand Medicaid left hundreds of thousands of low-income residents in a coverage gap, unable to afford insurance, yet ineligible for assistance. The result was a healthcare system that could not meet the needs of its people. Education, too, remained a battleground. In theory, Mississippi's schools were desegregated. In practice, they were as divided by race and class as ever. Funding disparities between wealthy suburban districts and impoverished rural ones were stark. Teachers in the Delta made far less than those in urban districts, and the state consistently ranked near the bottom in national education outcomes. Efforts to improve, through charter schools, voucher programs, and standardized testing, produced mixed results. For many students, particularly Black children in rural areas, education still felt like a gamble rather than a guarantee. Despite these challenges, pockets of innovation and renewal began to appear. Universities partnered with industry to create research centers and job training programs. Jackson State University, a historically Black university, became a leader in STEM education. In Oxford, the University of Mississippi expanded its reach in medicine and law. Community colleges reimagined their role, preparing students not only for transfer, but for immediate work in fields like robotics, nursing, and logistics. And grassroots organizations, many led by young Mississippians, focused on food justice, literacy, and civic engagement. Yet even as some institutions rose, others faltered. The capital city of Jackson faced a crisis of its own. Aging water systems failed, leaving residents without clean drinking water for days, sometimes weeks. Trash collection became inconsistent. Public transportation shrank. Crime spiked. Middle-class flight drained the tax base. The city, majority Black and chronically underfunded, became a national example of urban struggle in the South, both a product of systemic disinvestment and a site of extraordinary resilience. The population trends told a sobering story. Mississippi was shrinking. From the early 2000s into the 2000s, the state experienced net population loss, one of only a few states to do so. Young people, especially college graduates, left for better opportunities in Texas, Georgia, or the Carolinas. Brain drain became an epidemic. Entire high school graduating classes scattered across the country, few returning. What remained were the very old, the very poor, or those deeply committed to rebuilding from within. In the midst of these demographic shifts, Mississippi also began confronting its historical memory. Conversations about the state flag, long emblazoned with the Confederate battle emblem, had simmered for years. For decades, efforts to change the flag met political dead ends. But the national reckoning over racial justice in the summer of 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, pushed Mississippi to the tipping point. Athletes, clergy, business leaders, and students raised their voices. Universities stopped flying the flag. Religious denominations called for its removal. And under intense public pressure, the state legislature voted, finally, to retire the old flag. In November 2020, Mississippians approved a new design, one that bore a magnolia flower surrounded by stars. It was a symbolic break from the past, and for many, a long overdue step toward a more inclusive identity. But it was also just that. A symbol. The deeper work remained. Mississippi's challenges in the 21st century were no longer confined to race and politics alone. They were structural. How to fund rural hospitals, how to keep young people from leaving, how to attract 21st century jobs, how to prepare for the next hurricane or flood. Climate change made the Gulf Coast more vulnerable each year. The risk of storm surge, sea level rise, and more intense weather events loomed large. Katrina had taught bitter lessons, but infrastructure resilience was still a work in progress. And yet, for all its fragility, Mississippi endured. The spirit that once produced the blues now inspired new generations of artists, activists, and entrepreneurs. A new literary scene emerged in Jackson and Oxford. Musicians fused Delta traditions with hip-hop and soul. Filmmakers captured Southern complexity without caricature. And a new wave of civic leaders, many young, many women, many black, began to win local office, not on nostalgia, but on promises of progress. There was pain, yes. There was struggle. But there was also motion. The casino lights still glittered on the coast. The gospel choirs still sang on Sunday mornings. The cotton still grew in some fields. But Mississippi was changing. Not fast, not always evenly, but slowly, unmistakably. It was becoming something new. The storms would come again. The economy would rise and fall. But the story of Mississippi, always unfinished, always contested, would continue. Because in Mississippi, even when history weighs heavy, the future still calls. Chapter 11. The Flag, the Past, and the Future. For generations, the story of Mississippi has been one of beauty and burden, of rivers and rhythms, of injustice and endurance. It is a land that gave the world the blues, the voice of Faulkner, and the strength of Fannie Lou Hamer. But it is also a place where history has often weighed heavy, where symbols and scars have been carried for so long they seemed permanent. And of all those symbols, none captured the state's conflicted legacy more than a piece of cloth that flew over courthouses, schools, and front porches. The Mississippi state flag, emblazoned with the Confederate battle emblem in its upper corner. It was a flag that spoke different truths to different people. For some, it was a marker of heritage and pride, a link to ancestors and regional identity. For others, it was a banner of hate, a constant reminder of slavery, segregation, and the violence used to preserve white supremacy. But to understand how that flag came to define so much of Mississippi's modern struggle, one must go back, not to the Civil War, but to the decades after it, when the Confederacy had lost the war but not its grip on the Southern imagination. The flag that would eventually become Mississippi's official state banner was adopted in 1894. Nearly 30 years after the end of the Civil War, and just 4 years after the state rewrote its constitution to disenfranchise black voters through poll taxes and literacy tests. It was a moment of deliberate retrenchment, a period when the white political elite, threatened by the gains of Reconstruction, were reasserting dominance in every public institution. The choice to embed the Confederate battle flag, with its red field, blue cross, and 13 white stars, into the design was no accident. It was a statement. For most of the 20th century, the flag flew without controversy among those in power. It was stitched into school banners, waved at sporting events, and embedded in government seals. It became part of the visual language of the state, so ever-present that many stopped noticing, or pretended to. But for black Mississippians, and for growing numbers of others, the flag was never benign. It was the same symbol raised by lynch mobs, by segregationists who beat marchers in the 1960s, by those who fought tooth and nail to preserve Jim Crow. The first serious challenges to the flag began in the 1980s and 1990s, as civil rights veterans, lawmakers, and activists began to question its place in a modern, multiracial democracy. The issue simmered, often ignored by politicians who feared backlash, until it boiled over in 2001, when Mississippi held a statewide referendum on whether to replace the flag with a new design, one without Confederate imagery. It was a bold moment. National businesses had begun to raise concerns. University students protested. Local governments quietly took the flag down. But when the vote was held, nearly 2/3 of voters chose to keep the 1894 flag. The message was unmistakable. Change would not come easily. Still, the debate never disappeared. In classrooms and newsrooms, in sermons and city councils, the question lingered. What does this flag really represent? And to whom does Mississippi belong? Through the 2000s and 2010s, pressure built gradually. Schools like the University of Mississippi, known as Ole Miss, stopped flying the flag. Some cities and counties followed suit. National retailers refused to sell merchandise bearing the Confederate emblem. And with every new racially motivated mass shooting, every hate crime, every moment when the country was forced to confront the reality of systemic racism, eyes turned again to Mississippi. Then came 2020. In the wake of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, a national reckoning began. Across the country, statues were toppled, Confederate symbols were challenged, and millions took to the streets to demand not just reform, but transformation. Mississippi, long defined by its reluctance to change, found itself at the center of attention once again. Athletes spoke out. Business leaders issued public statements. Clergy, black and white, called the flag a stumbling block to unity and healing. And in a move that stunned many, the Southeastern Conference and the NCAA both announced that Mississippi would no longer be eligible to host championship events as long as the Confederate emblem remained on its flag. It was a line in the sand, and it pushed the state's lawmakers to act. On June 28, 2020, after decades of resistance, the Mississippi legislature voted to retire the 1894 flag. The measure passed in both chambers with bipartisan support, including votes from legislators who had once defended the flag on grounds of tradition. Republican Governor Tate Reeves, who had previously avoided the issue, signed the bill into law the next day. The flag was lowered from the Capitol in Jackson, folded, and placed in a museum. For the first time in over a century, Mississippi had no official state flag. But the story didn't end there. The legislation called for a commission to design a new flag, one that would include the phrase, "In God We Trust," and reflect the people of Mississippi in a way that united rather than divided. Hundreds of designs were submitted. Public hearings were held. Artists, historians, students, and citizens weighed in. Eventually, a design emerged. A blue background, a white magnolia blossom at the center, 20 stars surrounding it to represent Mississippi's status as the 20th state, and a single gold star to honor the indigenous people who once inhabited the land. In November 2020, Mississippians voted on the new design. And in a moment that would have been almost unthinkable just a few years earlier, over 70% of voters approved it. The new flag was officially adopted, and for many, it marked a turning point. Not an erasure of history, but a step toward something different. A choice to tell a new story. Still, the flag debate was never just about fabric. It was about identity, about how Mississippi sees itself, and how it wants to be seen by others. It was about memory, about which parts of the past are celebrated, which are silenced, and which are rewritten. And even as the old flag came down, the deeper question remained. Can Mississippi reckon with its past without being defined by it? The answer, as always in this state, is complicated. Monuments to the Confederacy still dot the courtyards of small towns. Statues of generals and unnamed soldiers stand in front of courthouses that once enforced segregation and disenfranchisement. Street names, school mascots, and memorial plaques continue to honor a cause that fought to preserve slavery. And while some communities have begun the hard work of reimagining public space, others have doubled down, passing ordinances to protect historical heritage from removal or revision. At the same time, new memorials have begun to rise. In Jackson, the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, opened in 2017, offers a powerful and unflinching look at the state's brutal history of racial oppression and the courage of those who fought against it. Through exhibits, testimonies, and artifacts, it tells the story of slavery, lynching, segregation, resistance, and renewal. It stands not far from the state capitol, a reminder that Mississippi's story is not only one of oppression, but also of defiance and transformation. In the Delta, small museums honor the legacy of the blues, not as entertainment, but as a survival language born from pain. In rural churches, photographs of civil rights martyrs still hang quietly on wood-paneled walls. In classrooms, teachers wrestle with how to tell the truth without losing jobs or facing backlash. And in living rooms across the state, conversations unfold, sometimes haltingly, between generations about what was, what is, and what might still be. Mississippi's racial tensions have not vanished. Police brutality, education inequality, healthcare disparities, and housing discrimination remain very real. The gap between white wealth and black poverty is wide. Political debates still often fall along racial lines. And yet, the state is also filled with people, black, white, and everything in between, who are working every day to bridge those divides. There are high school students organizing racial reconciliation events, faith leaders holding joint prayer services, artists and poets using their work to challenge old narratives, veterans fighting to preserve the memory of black soldiers erased from history. There are mayors, educators, farmers, and entrepreneurs who love Mississippi not despite its flaws, but because of them, because they see the beauty in what could be, and they're willing to work for it. The past is not easy to carry here. It never has been. The weight of slavery, of the burning crosses and bombed churches, of families separated by poverty and migration. It doesn't vanish with a new flag or a museum exhibit. But in Mississippi, the past doesn't just haunt. It also calls forward, reminding its people of the stakes of silence, the cost of forgetting, and the power of telling the truth. The struggle over monuments and memory is not unique to Mississippi. But in this state, where so much of America's pain has been concentrated, the stakes are especially high. How Mississippi chooses to remember will shape how it chooses to grow. Will the next generation inherit only the wounds, or will they also inherit the wisdom that comes from facing them? In the end, the story of Mississippi is not finished. It's still being written in classrooms and courtrooms, in songs and sermons, in quiet decisions and loud protests. The old flag came down, a new one went up. But the real change will come not from what flies above the Capitol, but from what is built in the neighborhoods, schools, and hearts across this deeply storied land. Mississippi's future is still unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, more hands are holding the pen. Chapter 12. Mississippi Today. Mississippi is a land haunted and hallowed, haunted by the weight of its past and hallowed by the brilliance of its culture, its voices, and its soil. To understand what Mississippi is today, you must listen not just with your ears, but with your bones. You must hear the cotton wind rustling through the delta, the jazz drifting across a summer porch, the preacher's voice thundering from a clapboard church, the silence of abandoned sharecropper shacks, and the echo of students marching for a future they couldn't yet see. Mississippi does not forget. It echoes. Even now, the state lives in constant conversation with its past. Not because it cannot move forward, but because it chooses to carry forward a story so complex, so filled with beauty and pain, that to ignore it would be to erase part of the American soul. Every road here is layered. Every town square and courthouse, every monument and cafe, every shout from a football stadium, and every jazz note from a juke joint. They all say the same thing: we are still here. Yet Mississippi today is not a relic. It is a living, breathing paradox, a state of contrasts, of roots and revolutions, of burden and brilliance, of poverty and poetry. Drive through Mississippi in the early morning, and you'll see the light fall softly over fields still tilled by the descendants of those who once worked them in chains. You'll pass through towns where time seems frozen, but where smartphones buzz with TikTok trends and teens stream music born generations ago in this very soil. Here, William Faulkner's imagined county of Yoknapatawpha might as well still exist. Just with Wi-Fi now, Mississippi remains one of the poorest states in the Union. Statistically speaking, generational poverty continues to weigh heavily on large swaths of the population, particularly in rural areas. The scars left by slavery, Jim Crow laws, redlining, and decades of underinvestment are still visible, not only in crumbling infrastructure or faltering schools, but in the quiet weariness of communities who feel forgotten by the broader American dream. Yet these same communities are often the heart of resilience. Churches organize food drives when government aid stalls. Barbershops become places of debate and hope. Grandmothers raise grandchildren with stories and song, passing down dignity in place of wealth. But do not mistake hardship for weakness. For every statistic that paints Mississippi in the shadows, there is a voice rising from the Delta, a guitar riff in a Clarksdale club, a poem written in a Jackson School notebook that may yet change the world. Because Mississippi is not just where America's sins were most visible, it's also where some of its most profound redemptions began. This is the state that produced Medgar Evers and Fannie Lou Hamer, yes, but also Oprah Winfrey and Morgan Freeman. The state that gave the world the blues, the bedrock of American music. B.B. King's guitar still hums through the airwaves, his every bend and slide a testimony to survival. His legacy isn't just in museums, it's in the rhythm of life here, in backyard concerts and teenagers learning licks on second-hand instruments. And it is impossible to separate Mississippi's present from its cultural legacy. The literature of this state carved deep marks into the American canon. Faulkner's voice, dense, winding, and mythic, still looms, not just in literary circles, but in the way Mississippians talk, pause, and reflect. His home, Roanoke, is a museum now. But more than that, it is a shrine to the complexity of the Southern mind. It is said that Faulkner believed the past is never dead. It's not even past. In Mississippi, that line is more than literary, it is prophecy. Then there is the food. Oh, the food. Catfish crisped to perfection, biscuits that flake like old hymnals, sweet tea poured with ritual reverence, gumbo with a heat that wakes up the dead. Mississippi cuisine is not a menu. It is a memory. Every dish is a story. Collard greens that taste like Sunday prayers. Peach cobbler that says, "Welcome home." Even food here has a rhythm, and that rhythm is not confined to kitchens. It pulses through the state's modern music scene. Gospel, blues, hip-hop, they all find new breath here. In the studios of Jackson, new artists lace modern beats with ancestral pain. In Oxford, students study old vinyls and write lyrics that blend past and present. The music never stopped. It just evolved. So too have the voices. Mississippi's new generation is rewriting the narrative. They are activists and entrepreneurs, artists and coders. In the face of systemic neglect, they build networks of care and opportunity. Social media gives voice to the silenced. Podcasts born in rural bedrooms now reach global audiences. TikToks showcase small-town life with pride and irony. The state's youth are no longer waiting for change. They are engineering it. And in politics, too, new winds blow. Grassroots organizers fight for better schools, for environmental justice in regions plagued by industrial dumping, for the right to vote without fear or obstruction. The state has seen bitter losses, yes, but it has also seen victories. Referendums passed, statues removed, new faces elected. Jackson, the capital, reflects this contradiction well. A city of possibility and struggle. Once called the city with soul, it lives up to the name with a tenacity that defies every setback. From water crises to economic hardship, Jackson survives because its people refuse to give up on it. Murals bloom on buildings like wildflowers in concrete. Local bookstores host poetry nights that brim with fire. Soul food joints sit beside vegan cafes, and college students debate James Baldwin in coffee shops. But Mississippi's story is not just about cities. Much of its soul still lies in the small towns, the places where front porches double as town halls, where family names go back generations, where gossip is currency and pride is sacred. In places like Tupelo or Natchez, traditions endure. Quilting circles, gospel choirs, high school football as religion. In these towns, you see the long shadow of history, but also the glimmer of future. You see a church built by enslaved hands next to a tech hub started by a 20-something. You hear a fiddle playing beside an iPhone. You feel time stacked, layered, like sediment in the Delta. And speaking of the Delta, there is something timeless about it. That alluvial plain where cotton once reigned supreme is no longer the economic engine it was, but it remains the spiritual heart of Mississippi. Here, poverty is often crushing. Healthcare access is limited, opportunities scarce. And yet, people endure. Children laugh, grandmothers dance, preachers thunder. And in juke joints on Friday nights, the blues still roll like thunder through tin walls. The Delta suffers, and the Delta sings. Why does Mississippi matter in the American story? Because it is America, intensified. It is America's original sins and most sacred hopes. It is the place where the nation's contradictions collide most violently and most beautifully. The place where a lynching and a hymn can both happen on the same day. Where freedom riders bled, but also where they triumphed. Where Faulkner's ghosts wander the same streets as schoolchildren holding iPads. Where a black woman can host a billion-dollar media empire after being born in Kosciuszko dirt. To look away from Mississippi is to look away from what America really is. Not what it claims to be, but what it truly is. Layered, flawed, beautiful, broken, capable of greatness. And perhaps that is what Mississippi teaches us most. That you can grow something holy in soil soaked with sorrow. That even the most wounded places can bloom. That the blues are not just music. They are a way to survive. The ghosts of Mississippi are many. But so are its prophets, its poets, its prophets in training. And so this story ends where it began. Not with conquests or dates or data, but with the heartbeat of a place that refuses to die. Mississippi today is not perfect. Far from it. But it is alive, and it is listening. The land still sings. Listen close, because the story of Mississippi is not over, not even close.